My name is Ethan Taylor, and for most of my adult life I have understood the world through the lens of interfaces, the microscopic boundary where one material ends and another begins, where a bond either holds under load or quietly, invisibly, begins to fail. I am 37 years old. I hold a doctorate in materials science, earned at a university whose laboratories smelled permanently of acetone and ambition, and my specialty, if you can call a decade of obsession a specialty, is graphene. A lattice of carbon atoms 1 atom thick, strong enough in theory to hold the weight of an elephant balanced on a pencil, and for years, useless outside of that theory. The scientific romance of graphene had already been written by the time I entered the field. What remained, what has occupied me since, was the unglamorous, unrelenting work of industrialization. How to disperse that single atomic layer through a polymer, a metal, a ceramic, at massive scale, without it clumping into worthless islands of itself. How to make the interface between graphene and everything else strong enough to matter. I did not know, when I began that work, that I would eventually need to apply the same question to my own life. Where does loyalty end and exploitation begin? Where is the interface, and how strong is the bond across it, really, when you press on it with your full weight? I was recruited 7 years ago by Samuel Vance, the founder and CEO of Alpha Engineering, a man who was 65 when we first shook hands and who wore his age like a well-tailored jacket, comfortably, deliberately, as though the wrinkles at his eyes had been placed there by a good designer rather than by time. Alpha Engineering was small then. A modest production floor, a payroll I could have recited from memory, and one enormous opportunity. SpaceX needed an advanced material for the small viewport windows of its spacecraft, something that could marry the optical clarity of a polymer with a strength profile no ordinary polymer could offer. Samuel needed someone who could turn a laboratory curiosity into a manufacturing line. He needed momentum, and momentum, I would learn, is a hungry thing that never announces when it has eaten enough. I still remember the office where he made his case to me, smaller then, humbler, with a window that looked out on a parking lot instead of a skyline. He leaned forward across his desk with his elbows planted and his hands loosely clasped, the posture of a man who wants you to believe he is holding nothing back. "Join me," he said, "and I will build you an R&D division that this industry envies. Not a laboratory chained to production schedules, a real division, with its own budget, its own headcount, protected from the noise downstairs." He told me my intellectual property would remain respected, that whatever I built would be developed, not buried. And he told me, third, that I would not simply be an employee of Alpha Engineering. I would be, in his words, a co-architect of what this company becomes. I believed him. I want to be honest about that, because everything that follows makes more sense if you understand that I was not naive out of foolishness. I was naive because the promises were specific, and specificity, in my experience, is usually a sign of sincerity. I did not yet know that a promise can be specific and still be temporary, true only for as long as it costs the person making it nothing. I said yes. I brought with me 3 patents I had developed during my doctoral years and had, fortunately for what would come later, filed under my own name rather than the university's or any sponsoring labs. A method for achieving homogeneous dispersion of graphene within polymer and metal matrices at industrial scale. A surface functionalization process that chemically modifies graphene to strengthen its interfacial bonding. The very concept that would come to define, in more ways than one, everything that happened to me. And a continuous processing procedure for manufacturing high-performance graphene composite sheets without the batch-to-batch inconsistency that had plagued the field. These 3 patents were not incremental improvements. They were the load path. Without them, Alpha Engineering's entire production architecture, every panel, every sheet, every aerospace component leaving that facility, was theoretical. I built the foundation, And then I spent 7 years building a company on top of it, brick by careful brick, while somehow forgetting to notice whose foundation it was. Alpha Engineering became, over those 7 years, a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. We produced graphene-reinforced polymer, metal, and ceramic composites at a scale no competitor could match, serving the aerospace sector, high-efficiency wind turbine manufacturers, and clients who needed electromagnetic radiation shielding for applications I still cannot discuss publicly. We expanded into 6 states, and the company's headcount grew alongside it. From the handful of people I could once have named from memory to just over 4,200 employees at our peak, spread across production floors, logistics networks, compliance offices, and sales teams that span the continent. My own division, by comparison, remained modest by design. 110 people at its largest, a fraction of the company's total workforce, though it was that fraction which determined, invisibly, whether the other 4,000 had anything worth manufacturing at all. Samuel appointed me head of the R&D division, a recognition, on paper, of what I had built. In practice, it was something closer to a velvet cage. He knew I had the capability to develop advanced materials better than anyone he could hire. He also knew, with the same clarity, that he did not want me anywhere near the corporate machinery, the boardroom conversations, the production strategy, the compliance apparatus that increasingly governed how the company moved. He isolated me, gently, by keeping me exactly where I was most valuable and least dangerous. I did not see it as isolation at the time. I saw it as focus. I told myself a man who loves his work should be grateful to be left alone to do it. Under my leadership, the R&D division became one of the most respected in the country within advanced materials. We were not merely competent. We were the origin point of half the process improvements that quietly kept the operations floor humming, even when nobody downstairs bothered to trace an efficiency gain back to its source. Our proudest achievement, still in its pilot phase when everything unraveled, was what we called atomically pre-aligned, ultra-high loading density composite. A self-assembling architecture in which graphene sheets orient themselves with uniform atomic alignment at loading densities above 50% volume fraction without agglomeration. If you are not an engineer, understand it this way. We were teaching atoms to organize themselves into formation at a density and precision that had never been achieved outside a handful of academic papers, and we were doing it at a scale that could eventually be manufactured. It was not yet commercial. It was, by every standard I know, extraordinary. The corporation did not see it that way. To Samuel, to the finance office, to the operations leadership that increasingly ran the company's actual conversations, our achievement was an asterisk. A line item that consumed budget and produced nothing that could be booked as revenue this quarter. They did not understand, or did not care to understand, how many of the operational efficiencies that made their profit margins so admirable had originated as unglamorous side discoveries in our laboratories, absorbed quietly into production without so much as a line of acknowledgement. R&D, in their accounting, was a cost center, a drain, a department that existed on borrowed patience. The first sign came at a gathering of precursor material vendors and technology partners, the kind of evening event with good lighting and better catering, designed to reassure everyone in the room that Alpha Engineering was healthy and ascending. Samuel stood at the podium and walked the audience through the architecture of the company's success. He praised his son, Kevin Vance, 40 years old and the company's CFO, for his financial discipline. He praised his niece, Letitia Carter, Director of Corporate Planning and Operations, for the precision of her restructuring initiatives. He thanked several operations and compliance managers by name, warmly, the way you thank people you plan to keep around. My name appeared once, a footnote on the final slide, in a font size clearly chosen by someone who did not expect anyone to read it. I sat in the audience with my hands folded tightly in my lap, My jaw set in a way I did not notice until it began to ache. Watching a man build a mythology of his company's success that somehow required no mention of the atoms it was built from. I told myself, that night, that perhaps it was an oversight. Men like Samuel are busy. Men like Samuel forget things. The second incident left no room for that kind of mercy. It came at the company's anniversary gathering, the one event each year when every employee, technicians, engineers, administrative staff, all of it, occupied the same room at the same time. Samuel announced a projected net revenue of $115 million for the year, and the room applauded the way rooms are trained to applaud. He credited the operations division as the company's profit center, its true engine. And then, almost as an aside, the offhand cruelty of it is what I remember most. The way he said it without even lowering his voice for effect, as though it were too obvious a fact to require gravity. He called the R&D division a cost center, a budget line that consumed resources and, in his phrasing, produced nothing we can put on a balance sheet. Letitia followed him to the microphone with the practiced calm of someone delivering bad news she had rehearsed enough times to enjoy. Budget optimization was coming, she said. Divisions that generated profit would be strengthened. Divisions that did not would be restructured, reviewed, or, the word she chose, bloodless and administrative, right-sized. I did not applaud. I sat very still, my spine rigid against the back of my chair, my hands cold despite the warmth of the room, while $115 million of projected revenue was credited to everyone except the 3 patents underneath the entire operation. Around me, I could feel my own division's unease radiating outward like heat off asphalt. Priya, one of our research engineers, stared fixedly at the tablecloth. Mark, our product developer, had gone the particular shade of pale that precedes real anger. Eleanor Go, our process development specialist, kept glancing toward me as if I might, through some act of engineering, undo what had just been said. Andrew, our data scientist, simply closed his eyes. We did not discuss it that night. We discussed it the next morning, in the small conference room with the whiteboard nobody ever erased properly, in the low voices of people who have just learned that their competence has been quietly reclassified as a liability. The reclassification did not stay theoretical for long. Within weeks, several of our technicians were reassigned to the production floor. Temporary, we were told, to support operational throughput, though everyone in that building understood a temporary reassignment is simply a permanent one wearing a disguise. I watched people I had trained, people whose hands had helped align sheets of graphene with a precision most of the country could not replicate, get folded into the maintenance schedule like spare parts. It was in that period that something in me, I want to say hardened, but it is more accurate to say clarified, settled into a decision I had not yet consciously made. I began keeping records. Quietly, over the following weeks, I gathered what I should have gathered years earlier. My original employment contract, correspondence documenting my contributions and achievements, and, most critically, the clauses buried deep in that contract's intellectual property section, clauses I suspected no one at Alpha Engineering had read closely in years, if ever. I consulted an intellectual property attorney named Monica, a woman whose calm was the kind that comes from genuine competence rather than performance. She reviewed the IP status attached to my 3 foundational patents and told me, with the flat certainty of someone reading a load calculation rather than delivering news, that the facility's entire production process operated under a license to my intellectual property, a license I retained the right to revoke at will. Alpha Engineering was not, as its leadership seemed to assume, a fortress built on its own bedrock. It was a structure standing on land it did not own, and the lease could end whenever I chose to end it. The confrontation, when it came, arrived on a Thursday morning. I was summoned to Kevin Vance's office. A room engineered, I understood the moment I stepped inside, for intimidation rather than work. Floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the production campus. A desk of dark polished wood too large for any function it actually served, framed accolades on the walls angled just so, to catch a visitor's eye without seeming to try. Letitia was already seated when I arrived, her posture immaculate, her hands folded with the composed stillness of someone who has decided in advance how a conversation will end. Kevin did not stand when I entered. He gestured, almost lazily, to the chair across from him, a small, deliberate assertion of who held the room. Letitia opened, her voice pitched with the smooth, unhurried cadence of someone reading from a document she had already memorized. "Ethan, we want this conversation to be constructive," she said, folding her hands a fraction tighter. "So I'll be direct. The R&D division, in its current form, no longer aligns with the company's operational priorities. We've reviewed the numbers. It consumes resources it does not return." She did not look at me while she said it. She looked at a point somewhere above my shoulder, the practiced gaze of someone who has learned that eye contact makes bad news harder to deliver cleanly. "Boring numbers," Kevin added, leaning back in his chair with the loose, proprietary comfort of a man in his own territory, "for a boring return. That's the truth of it, isn't it? 7 years, and what have we got that we can put a price on? A lab full of prototypes nobody's buying." He said it with the faint upward curl at the corner of his mouth that people use when they believe they are being generous by not saying something crueler. I felt the heat climb the back of my neck, that familiar physical signal I've learned, after years of defending difficult results in front of skeptical review boards, to recognize as the leading edge of controlled anger. Not the kind that makes a man raise his voice, but the kind that makes him lower it. I leaned forward instead, forearms resting on my knees, my eyes fixed on Kevin's without blinking. "Research and development is not an indulgence," I said. "It is the only mechanism by which this company remains competitive in a field defined entirely by the pace of innovation. Your father promised, explicitly, to strengthen this division as a condition of my joining the company 7 years ago. I have the correspondence." Something flickered behind Kevin's eyes at the mention of correspondence, a small, involuntary tightening, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, the look of a man recalculating in real time. He recovered by reaching for authority instead of argument. "My father's promises aren't my problem," he said, his jaw setting, a flush climbing visibly from his collar toward his ears. "What is my problem is a division head who thinks he can walk into this office and lecture the CFO. Keep talking like that, and I will have you written up for insubordination." I felt something in me go very cold and very still, the way a material behaves in the instant just before it reaches its yield point, all the stored tension finally finding somewhere to go. "You're welcome to try," I said, without raising my voice at all. Letitia's composure held, but her fingers, I noticed, had gone rigid against the back of her folded hands, the small betrayal of someone who had expected the meeting to end more easily than this. "This isn't personal, Ethan," she said, which is the sentence people reach for precisely when a thing has become personal. "It's restructuring. R&D will be folded into equipment maintenance, effective next quarter. No budget will be allocated to independent research going forward. That decision has already been made." Kevin stood then, buttoning his jacket with the small theatrical flourish of a man ending a meeting on his own terms. "You're no one important to this company," he said, his voice flat, final, meant to close the door on the conversation entirely. "Never were. You just had a good few years." I stood as well, and buttoned my own jacket with hands that did not shake. "Alpha Engineering will come to regret the decision it just made," I said, quietly, at the door, "and I'm not afraid to be the one who told you so." I asked to see Samuel that same afternoon. He received me in his office, and the warmth that had greeted me at every previous meeting for 7 years was simply absent, The way a room feels different once the furniture has been removed, even if you cannot immediately say what changed. He gestured to the chair across from him without rising, his eyes already guarded in a way I had never once seen in 7 years, and waited for me to speak first. I spoke with Kevin and Letitia this morning, I said. I want to hear it from you directly. Are you restructuring R&D out of existence? Samuel folded his hands on the desk, deliberately, the gesture of a man choosing composure over comfort. The company is making a strategic decision, Ethan. Nothing more. You promised me, 7 years ago, that this division would be strengthened, I said. You said it in the same office, smaller then, with the same hands folded the way they are now. That promise is the reason I said yes to you instead of 3 other companies that made me offers that year. For a moment, something crossed his face, not quite regret, closer to the discomfort of a man being shown an old photograph of himself he'd rather not recognize. But it passed quickly, smoothed over by the same practiced calm that had built his company. Promises made 7 years ago don't carry obligations today. Not when they contradict the company's present interests, he said, his voice level, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. Alpha Engineering has always been guided by one principle above the rest: growth and financial strength. If you can no longer align yourself with that direction, Ethan, you're free to resign. He said it so easily. That was the detail I kept returning to afterward. How little it cost him to say it. How casually the words left him, with no calculation behind his eyes at all. He had no idea what those words would cost him. He genuinely did not understand that the license permitting his company to use my intellectual property in its production process would lapse the moment I stopped working there. He believed, as so many executives believe about the engineers who build their fortunes, that the license belonged to the company rather than to me. I understand your position completely, I said, and then I reached into my jacket and withdrew an envelope I had prepared days earlier, the paper crisp against my fingers, and set it on his desk without ceremony. He looked down at it, then up at me, and I watched something shift across his face in the span of perhaps 2 seconds. A flicker of genuine alarm behind his eyes, the color leaving his cheeks in a way no amount of boardroom composure could fully mask, his hand rising unconsciously toward the envelope, as though he might physically stop what it represented. Ethan, think about this, he said, his voice losing its earlier flatness, gaining an urgency that hadn't been there 30 seconds before. The financial position here, the career trajectory, nowhere else will offer you what this company can offer you. I've thought about very little else, I said. He tried once more, leaning forward now, his composure fraying visibly at the edges. You're making a mistake you won't be able to undo. When I didn't answer, when my expression didn't move, his tone shifted again, the persuasion curdling into something closer to a threat. You signed a great deal when you joined this company, Ethan. Non-disclosure obligations, recommendations, opportunities in this field. They don't come easily to people who leave the wrong way. Check the file, Samuel, I said, standing. I never signed an NDA on my way out. Nobody ever thought to ask me to. I left the envelope on his desk and walked out without waiting for a response, because there was, for the first time in 7 years, nothing further I needed to hear from him. I resigned that day. I told my team myself, gathering Priya, Mark, Eleanor, and Andrew in our small conference room, and I watched grief pass over each of their faces in its own particular shape. Eleanor's eyes brightening with tears she refused to let fall, Mark's hands curling into loose fists at his sides, Andrew simply staring at the table as though it might rearrange itself into a different outcome. They understood, better than the executives upstairs ever would, exactly what my departure meant for the company's future. I had been right in Samuel's office, and it would matter more than either of us understood in that moment. No one at Alpha Engineering had ever thought to correct the gap in my contract, because no one there had ever imagined I would leave. The call came 3 days later, on a number I didn't recognize, while I was still sitting at my kitchen table surrounded by the quiet wreckage of unemployment. A laptop open to nothing in particular, a coffee gone cold. I almost let it go to voicemail. When I answered, the voice on the other end introduced itself simply. "Ethan, this is Liam Crawford." I sat up so quickly, I nearly knocked the cold coffee off the table. Liam Crawford was not a name I expected to hear directed at me, and certainly not from the man himself, CEO of Hoffman and Crawford Materials, Alpha Engineering's most capable competitor, a name I had spent 7 years reading about in trade publications rather than hearing in my own kitchen. My grip tightened involuntarily around the phone, and for a moment I said nothing at all, the silence stretching just long enough to be noticeable. "You still there?" Liam asked, and I could hear the faint amusement in his voice, the sound of a man who has made this kind of call before and knows exactly what it does to the person receiving it. "I'm here," I said, recovering enough to keep my voice level, though my pulse had not yet caught up with my composure. I wasn't expecting. I stopped myself, unsure how to finish the sentence honestly. "I imagine not," he said, and there was no cruelty in it, only the plain satisfaction of a competitor who has been watching a rival stumble. "Word travels fast in this industry, Ethan, especially when it involves someone with 3 foundational patents walking out the door of a multi-billion-dollar materials company. I won't waste your time with sympathy you didn't ask for. I'm calling because I want you at Hoffman and Crawford." He did not hedge, and he did not pad the offer with the usual cushioning language executives use when they're unsure of themselves. "I want you as director of operations," he said, "not as a staff scientist, not as a consultant brought in to fix someone else's mess. Director of operations, full authority over how this company builds what it builds. Salary at double what Alpha Engineering was paying you. And equity, a real ownership stake, not a bonus dressed up to look like one. I want you invested in what this company becomes, the way you clearly were never allowed to be invested in the last one." I sat back in my chair, the coffee entirely forgotten now, running the numbers almost against my will, the reflex of an engineer who cannot help but check whether a proposed figure survives a sanity check. Double the salary was a substantial claim on its own. Equity was the part that actually stopped me, the part no one at Alpha Engineering had ever once mentioned in 7 years of conversations about my future there. I had been offered raises before. I had never, not once, been offered a stake in what I was building. "Why me, specifically?" I said, still testing whether the offer was as unconditional as it sounded. "You could hire a dozen materials PhDs for less." "I could," Liam said. "But none of them built the interface Alpha Engineering has been standing on for 7 years. I don't want a materials scientist, Ethan. I want the foundation." He let that sit for a second before adding, more quietly, "Take the weekend if you need it." "I don't think you will." I didn't take the weekend. I accepted before the call ended. 2 weeks into my new role, Samuel called me. His voice had lost its coldness entirely. What remained was something closer to desperation dressed in the language of opportunity. He offered more money to return. I understood, by then, exactly what had prompted the call. Someone in his legal department had finally begun asking the questions that should have been asked 7 years earlier. I declined and told him plainly that I had already begun my work at Hoffman and Crawford Materials. A week after that call, I received a formal warning from Alpha Engineering's legal division, alleging the potential disclosure of confidential trade information. I read it twice, and I remember laughing, not from amusement, but from the particular disbelief that arrives when irony reaches a level too precise to be accidental. The same company now accusing me of misusing its secrets was, at that very moment, continuing to manufacture products using my patented processes without any license to do so. I forwarded the letter to Monica. Her response, when it arrived at Alpha Engineering's offices, was precise enough to draw blood without raising its voice. A clear, documented explanation that Alpha Engineering held no rights whatsoever to the intellectual property and licensing underlying its graphene composite production. I was told later, by someone still working there who reached out quietly to warn me of nothing in particular, just to talk, that the boardroom on the day that letter arrived had gone very silent and then very loud. Samuel's legal team spent the following weeks in a state of controlled panic that I only heard about secondhand, conducting the deep audit they should have commissioned before ever sending a warning letter to the one person who could unmake their entire production line with a single revoked license. What they found, according to the same quiet source who kept me informed, was worse than anyone in that boardroom had allowed themselves to imagine. The 3 patents underlying every graphene composite Alpha Engineering had ever manufactured had been licensed to the company under a personal, revocable agreement signed between me and Samuel directly. In the earliest days of the company, back when Alpha Engineering was still small enough that a handshake and a 2-page letter felt like sufficient formality. That original agreement had never been re-executed, reassigned, or converted into an irrevocable corporate license as the company expanded from a single production floor into 6 states and a multi-billion-dollar balance sheet. Every subsequent contract, every corporate restructuring, every new facility Alpha Engineering had opened in the years since had simply assumed the license traveled with the company automatically. It had not. It had only ever traveled with me. Their attorneys cross-referenced patent filings against 7 years of production records, 7 years of facility expansions, 7 years of client contracts built on top of a legal foundation that had quietly expired the moment I signed my resignation letter, and the conclusion they reached, the fatal, irreversible conclusion, was that Alpha Engineering had been manufacturing its core product line without any enforceable right to do so for weeks, and would continue to have no such right for as long as I chose to withhold it. Samuel called me one final time about the license itself, and the change in him was audible before he had said more than a few words. Gone entirely was the level, calibrated voice I remembered from 7 years of meetings. The instrument-precise tone he used to close negotiations and steady rooms. What replaced it was thinner, faster, punctuated by pauses that weren't strategic, only exhausted. "Ethan," he said, "I want to buy the license outright. Exclusive. Whatever number makes this go away, we'll find it." There was no negotiation posture left in him at all, no leverage he was pretending to hold. He sounded, for the first time since I had known him, like a man reading from a script written by his lawyers rather than one written by his own confidence. A founder watching the one asset he had never bothered to properly secure become the instrument of his company's undoing. "I'm not selling exclusivity, Samuel," I told him. He was quiet long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "Then what do you want?" he said finally, and there was no fight left in the question at all, only the flat resignation of a man who had run out of positions to negotiate from. I offered him a non-exclusive license instead, renewable annually, at a fee of $14.5 million per year. A number Monica and I arrived at only after careful calculation of what those 3 patents were actually worth to a company that had built over $100 million in projected annual revenue on the strength of processes it did not, in any enforceable sense, own. He accepted without argument, without the counteroffer I had half expected, without even the pretense of considering it overnight. "Send the paperwork," he said, and the call ended there, without either of us saying goodbye. Which felt, in its own way, like the most honest note either of us had struck with the other in years. The injustice Alpha Engineering had inflicted on me became, through a mechanism I could not have designed even if I had tried, the foundation of a fortune I had never expected and the confirmation of a worth I had spent 7 years being taught to doubt. In the months that followed, I brought Priya, Mark, Eleanor, and Andrew to Hoffman and Crawford Materials, rebuilding, piece by careful piece, the division that Alpha Engineering had once dismissed as a cost with no return. What none of us fully anticipated was how quickly the absence of that division would be felt on the other side. Within a single year, Alpha Engineering lost its capacity to lead the industry it had once helped define. SpaceX. The very client whose original request for advanced viewport materials had built the company's first real momentum 7 years earlier, quietly moved its contracts elsewhere once it became clear that Alpha Engineering's pipeline of genuine innovation had gone silent, and that the annual licensing arrangement propping up its existing product line was a stopgap, not a foundation for future development. 2 other major aerospace clients followed within months, unwilling to build long-term component contracts around a supplier that could no longer demonstrate a credible research roadmap. Without new composite architectures in development, without a laboratory capable of answering the next generation of specifications its clients were beginning to demand, Alpha Engineering had nothing left to offer beyond what it had already sold for years. And in an industry defined entirely by the pace of innovation, standing still is its own form of falling behind. The consequences reached the production floor before the fiscal year was even over. Facilities in 2 of the 6 states Alpha Engineering had once expanded into were shuttered entirely, their equipment liquidated at a fraction of its installed value. Their workforces let go in the kind of quiet, staggered layoffs companies use when they hope no single headline will capture the full scope of the decline. I heard, from the same former colleague who had once warned me about the mood in the boardroom, that the total headcount fell by nearly a third within 18 months. Production technicians, quality engineers, logistics staff, people who had never once had a say in the decisions that led there, absorbing the cost of a mistake made in a glass-walled office by men who had never bothered to read their own licensing agreements. It was, I confess, a difficult thing to watch even from a distance. I had spent 7 years building something inside those walls, and no matter how thoroughly its leadership had earned what followed, the people on that production floor had not. Alpha Engineering did not collapse in any dramatic, headline-worthy fashion. It simply diminished, month after month, into precisely the kind of company it had once been too proud to imagine becoming. A mid-tier supplier trading on a shrinking reputation, unable to win new contracts, unable to retain the ones it had, quietly absent from every industry conversation about what advanced materials would look like next. There is a particular sadness in watching an ambitious thing become an ordinary one, not through some singular catastrophe, but through years of small, compounding neglect finally arriving all at once to collect what they were owed. Before any of us touched that research again, I asked Monica the question directly, not because I doubted the answer, but because an engineer who has just watched one company misjudge its own legal footing does not care to repeat the mistake in the opposite direction. Could we continue developing the atomically pre-aligned architecture at Hoffman and Crawford without dragging a second employer into the kind of dispute that had just consumed my last one? Monica's answer, when it came, was thorough enough that I kept the letter. 3 conditions, laid out with the same flat precision she'd used against Alpha Engineering's legal division, made the position clean. First, the architecture had never been formally claimed as company intellectual property in the first place. My employment contract's invention assignment clause, like most in the industry, only transferred ownership of work that had been reduced to practice and formally disclosed through Alpha Engineering's internal invention disclosure process, precisely so the company could file for patent protection on it. We had never filed that disclosure because management had spent the technology's entire pilot phase insisting it was worthless, a cost center's indulgence rather than an asset worth the paperwork of protecting. A company cannot claim ownership, after the fact, over an invention it spent 2 years publicly refusing to recognize as one. Second, the architecture was not a freestanding invention at all, but a direct, dependent extension of the 3 foundational patents I had filed years before ever joining Alpha Engineering and had only ever licensed to the company, never assigned. Any research building on dispersion methodology, surface functionalization, or continuous processing traced its lineage back to intellectual property that had remained mine throughout. Alpha Engineering held a license to use those foundations in its existing production line, not a claim on whatever I chose to build with them next. Third, and most simply, I had taken nothing physical with me. No lab notebooks, no proprietary datasets, no documentation belonging to the company. What I carried out the door was knowledge, the accumulated understanding of a decade's work held in my own head, and knowledge of that kind, absent a signed non-compete or non-disclosure agreement, neither of which I had ever executed, is not something a court can order returned. Monica put it more bluntly, in the kind of sentence I suspect she'd been waiting years to use on someone. They didn't just fail to protect their production process, Ethan. They failed to protect the thing that was actually going to matter. You're not walking away with their secret. You're walking away with your own. Hoffman and Crawford Materials followed the opposite trajectory. The division we rebuilt did not simply replicate what I had developed at Alpha Engineering. It completed it. The atomically pre-aligned, ultra-high loading density composite architecture, still a pilot-stage curiosity when I left my old laboratory, became, under Liam's willingness to fund genuine research rather than merely tolerate it, a fully commercialized manufacturing platform within 2 years. Eleanor solved the aggregation instability that had limited us to small-batch production. Andrew's modeling work cut our qualification timeline for new aerospace clients nearly in half. Priya and Mark, freed from the budget anxieties that had shadowed every proposal at Alpha Engineering, pushed the self-assembly process past 55% volume fraction without agglomeration, a benchmark that, as far as I know, no other company in the world has yet matched. Hoffman and Crawford became, within a remarkably short span, the most respected name in advanced materials engineering in the country. A genuine leader, not merely in revenue, but in the kind of pioneering research that actually moves a field forward, built on the simple, almost embarrassingly obvious principle that a company which properly invests in the people doing its foundational work will eventually be repaid many times over, while a company that treats that same work as an expense to be minimized will eventually discover, often too late, exactly what it was choosing to discard. I think often, still, about interfacial strength, about what determines whether a bond between 2 different materials holds under load or fails catastrophically at the boundary. The engineering answer is always the same. The bond is only as strong as the surface preparation, the chemistry of the connection, the honesty of the contact between the 2 phases. You cannot fake an interface. You cannot paint over a weak bond and expect it to bear weight it was never actually given the chemistry to bear. Alpha Engineering tried, for 7 years, to build an empire on an interface it never properly secured, assuming that gratitude, or inertia, or my own quiet dedication to the work itself would substitute for genuine respect. It was, in the end, a fundamentally incorrect assumption arrived at by people who understood balance sheets far better than they understood the material. And the man, actually holding their company together,